At the far edge of Tsavo Reserve, the pale dust lay undisturbed except for a single narrow trail of shallow prints, each one pressed deeper on the front edge than the back. The prints ended at a small, motionless shape curled on its side, its legs folded awkwardly, ribs lifting only in the slightest of movements. The elephant calf's skin was dry, its flanks hollowed, and the tip of its trunk rested in the dirt as though even lifting it had become too great an effort. Flies gathered around the corner of its eyes, the faintest tremor passing through its tail before it lay still again. Not far away, a lone female elephant moved slowly in a wide arc, her trunk sweeping low, ears fanning at irregular intervals. She did not come close, but her eyes remained fixed on the calf, each turn of her body angled back toward him. Ranger Samuel stepped down from the path first, his boots sinking slightly into the loose ground. He did not speak at once, but his eyes followed the rise and fall of the calf's side, counting each breath. The rhythm was slow and uneven, the chest barely lifting. "Easy now," he said quietly, almost as if the sound might keep the fragile movement going. His hand hovered just above the calf's skin, feeling the heat radiating upward. Dehydration had set in. The skin was tight and the breathing shallow. Overhead, the sun was still climbing, but already the air was heavy enough to leach moisture from every living thing. The mother's pace shifted as Samuel drew nearer. She took 2 steps forward, then stopped, curling her trunk toward herself before lowering it to the ground again. The sound that rose from her chest was low and steady, not loud enough to carry far, but it vibrated through the still air. It was neither a warning nor a call to move. It was a sound of presence, a reminder that she was here. Samuel glanced over his shoulder, signaling with one raised hand for the rest of the team to hold position. The space between the mother and the calf was delicate. One wrong move could send her forward at a pace they couldn't control. Leah, the field assistant, crouched at the edge of the thornbush line, her eyes moving from the mother's shifting weight to the calf's slow breaths. "He's fading," she murmured, her voice low enough that only Samuel heard. A faint twitch passed through the calf's ear, but there was no sign of him trying to rise. Samuel noted the faint pulse in the dirt where the calf's trunk touched, each breath making only the lightest disturbance. The mother's tusks caught the light as she moved again, the sharpness of the ivory at odds with the hesitation in her steps. Every second mattered. If they advanced too quickly, the mother could charge and end any chance of helping. If they waited, the heat and exhaustion could finish what dehydration had begun. The balance was exacting, and Samuel knew the signs. The droop of the calf's head, the stillness of its limbs, meant time was slipping. He shifted slightly, kneeling lower so that his profile stayed small, his body language soft. The mother's ears lifted, then eased back to half-mast. Her breathing was quick but measured, and for the first time since they arrived, she did not step away. The sound of the wind through the thorn trees was dry and brittle, and the only movement came from the ripple of skin over the mother's flanks as a fly landed and she brushed it away. The calf's sides moved again, but the gap between each rise was longer now. Samuel's gaze met Leah's, and no words were needed. If they were to keep this animal alive, the next move would have to come soon. Still, he waited a moment longer, eyes on the mother, reading the smallest signs in the set of her feet and the tilt of her head. The distance between them was not just physical. It was the space between survival and loss, and it was narrowing with every slow, shallow breath. The mother held her ground, her vast frame half hidden by the thorn bush that cut a jagged line between her and the humans. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the soft grind of soil under her pads carrying in the stillness. Her head remained low, angled toward the calf, but her eyes flicked briefly to the figures crouched nearby. Each slow sway of her trunk was measured, sweeping dust and scent toward her before coiling loosely again. The calf, still on his side, gave a faint shudder that barely lifted his ribs. His trunk twitched once, then fell still, and the shallow dip in the dust where it lay became motionless once more. Samuel kept his posture low, one knee in the dirt, eyes fixed not on the calf, but on the mother. Every tilt of her ears, every pause in her breathing could tell him which way this would turn. The space between them was too narrow to be careless, yet too wide to give help without crossing it. "She's guarding, but she's not pressing forward," Leah whispered, her voice even and calm. Samuel's glance met hers for a moment before returning to the cow. Her chest rose quickly, the skin tightening along her flanks with each breath. She scraped the ground once with the edge of her forefoot, a small plume of dust lifting before settling again. The team had seen mothers stand like this for hours, watching, calculating, deciding. This one seemed caught between the instinct to remain near her calf and the caution that kept her from closing the distance while people were present. A single step from her could change everything. A single step from them could do the same. The air between them was thick with unspoken risk. Every minute the calf stayed down, his body was losing strength he would not easily regain. The mother's hesitation bought time for her to watch, but it was time the calf did not have. A faint breeze passed through the thornbush, carrying the warm scent of elephant skin and the faint sweetness of dry grass. The mother raised her trunk and held it suspended, nostrils flaring as she took in the smell of the humans, the water canisters, and the sweat from hours in the heat. The calf gave another weak tremor, his hind leg twitching once before falling still again. Samuel's gaze returned to him, counting the seconds between breaths. They were lengthening, a slow, uneven rhythm that told him the body was drawing from reserves already too low. The mother lowered her trunk again, resting the tip against the ground in front of her. It was a gesture that could mean calm, but it could also change in an instant. Samuel let his hand fall loosely to his side, his movements deliberate, meant to signal that they were not a threat. His mind worked through the sequence of steps ahead. Approach, assess, hydrate, and stabilize. Each one carried its own risks, but without them, the calf's breathing might stop altogether. She took half a step forward, her eyes locked on Samuel, and then stopped. The dust she disturbed drifted across the ground toward the calf's still form. Her ears fanned out slightly before folding back again, the movement slow and controlled. Samuel exhaled, barely audible, reading it as a sign she was not ready to drive them off. Still, he knew how quickly her stance could change. If she advanced too fast, there would be no time to reach the calf. If they moved too soon, they might lose the fragile chance her watchfulness was giving them. Leah shifted her position by a fraction, her hand resting lightly on the rim of the water container. The sound was almost nothing, but the mother's head lifted a little higher, her trunk rising partway as if to check the air again. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Samuel's eyes went back to the calf, his breathing now so shallow it seemed to pause between each rise of the ribs. Every sign said the same thing. The mother's watch could not last forever, and the calf's time was running out. The choice to close the distance was coming, whether she made it or they did. Samuel's weight shifted forward as he tested the ground with a slow, deliberate step, his boots pressing into the loose soil without a sound. The mother's ears lifted slightly, then settled, her trunk coiling loosely beneath her chin. Her stillness told him what he needed to know. There was no immediate aggression, only guarded watchfulness. He moved in a wide arc rather than a straight line, his path designed to keep his body angled away from hers. The air between them felt charged, a narrow thread of tolerance holding. Behind him, Leah stayed crouched, eyes following both elephant and ranger in equal measure. The calf lay motionless, its ribs lifting so faintly that Samuel counted twice to be certain there was breath at all. As he drew close, the smell of dry hide and warm dust filled the air. Kneeling slowly, he kept his profile low, his gaze steady on the calf's side rather than the mother. Her trunk extended, hovering for a moment before lowering back toward the dirt. Samuel reached out. his fingertips finding the soft skin just below the calf's jawline. The pulse was faint and uneven, as if the heart labored with each beat. He shifted slightly, leaning closer until his ear hovered above the calf's nostrils. The breath was shallow, warm, and spaced by long pauses that made his own heartbeat quicken. If circulation slowed further, the organs could begin shutting down. If the breathing stopped, there would be no recovery in this heat. The mother let out a deep, rolling rumble, the sound carrying low through the ground rather than the air. Samuel froze, hand resting lightly on the calf's shoulder. The calf's ear flicked in response, a small sign of awareness, faint but present. He exhaled slowly, his voice kept low and steady. "It's all right, little one." The words were not meant to soothe in a human sense, but to maintain a calm rhythm in his own movements. Overhead, the sky was clear and unbroken, the sun's heat already building toward its midday peak. Without shade, the calf's body temperature could rise dangerously fast. Hydration and cooling would be essential, but moving him now could trigger panic in the mother. Samuel glanced back toward Leah and gave the smallest nod, a signal that the calf was alive but weakening. She stayed in place, knowing the next steps would have to be measured. The mother's eyes shifted from Samuel to the calf and back again, her stance unchanged but her weight subtly forward. He noted the alignment of her feet and the slight tension in her shoulders. Readiness, not aggression. That narrow window of trust was open, but it would not stay that way indefinitely. Every passing minute made intervention both more necessary and more risky. With his palm still against the calf's flank, Samuel felt the shallow rise of each breath, counting again, listening for changes in rhythm. There was no improvement. The chest moved, then paused for long moments before the next breath arrived. He pressed gently against the calf's side, testing for any sign of a voluntary response. A faint quiver passed through the leg, but there was no effort to rise. If the calf could not lift its head soon, the airway might become compromised. If it lost consciousness entirely, even immediate care might not be enough. He eased his hand away, keeping his movements slow as he straightened to one knee. The mother's trunk lifted again. Stretching toward him, her breath audible this time. She was close enough now that he could feel the faint stir of air as she exhaled. The distance between them had shrunk without a single step on his part. She had closed it herself, choosing observation over confrontation. Samuel stayed still, letting the moment settle. The calf's breathing rattled faintly, a reminder that every choice here carried the weight of survival. Soon, they would have to act. The space between hesitation and help was narrowing to nothing. Leah moved in from the edge of the clearing, her steps slow and angled so the mother could watch every moment. In her hands, a shallow basin sloshed with water, its surface trembling with each shift of her weight. Samuel stayed beside the calf, his posture low and steady. The mother's gaze followed Leah, her trunk lifting halfway before settling again. When Leah reached him, she lowered herself to the ground, placing the basin within Samuel's reach without leaning over the calf. The air was hot and dry, pressing down on them, and every second they delayed risked the calf's condition worsening. His breathing was still shallow, his eyes half-lidded, the heat drawing moisture from him faster than his body could cope. Samuel dipped a clean cloth into the water and let it soak before lifting it, droplets sliding back into the basin. He pressed the damp fabric along the calf's trunk. Then behind the ears, where the skin was thinner and blood vessels ran close to the surface. The calf twitched slightly at the contact, his ear giving a weak flick. Across the clearing, the mother stepped forward, a low rumble forming in her chest. Samuel froze, his hand resting on the calf's side. She stopped after a single stride, her head lowering just enough to signal she was watching but not advancing further. The balance was fragile. Too much intrusion could shift her from watchfulness to defense in an instant. With careful hands, Samuel repeated the motion, cooling the sensitive spots first to help bring the calf's temperature down without shocking his system. Leah filled the cloth again, squeezing a few drops toward the calf's mouth. The liquid slid down the inside of the trunk, and his throat moved in a small, slow swallow. It was a sign of response. But giving too much too quickly could cause him to choke or worsen his weakness. They would have to pace it, allowing his body to accept the water in small amounts. If they rushed, the risk could outweigh the benefit. The mother's rumble deepened for a moment before fading, her trunk sweeping the ground near her feet. Samuel glanced at her briefly, noting the stillness of her stance. She was holding the line, close enough to intervene, far enough to allow their work. The calf gave a soft exhale that fluttered dust near his mouth. Samuel turned the cloth, pressing the cooler side against the folds of skin along the calf's neck, watching for any increase in breathing rhythm. The change was minimal but present, a fractional shortening of the pauses between each rise of his ribs. Leah shifted slightly, keeping her body angled away from the mother, and dipped the cloth again. This time, Samuel let a few more drops run down the calf's trunk, his eyes on the small muscles at the corner of the jaw. Another swallow followed, slow and deliberate. It was progress, but the urgency remained. Dehydration this advanced could take hours to reverse, and without continued cooling, the heat could undo their effort. Each minute without proper hydration kept the risk high. The mother took another step forward, her shadow stretching toward them. Her ears shifted outward briefly before settling close to her head. Samuel stayed still, the cloth resting lightly on the calf's skin, his other hand steady at the shoulder. She stopped just outside the reach of his arm, the tip of her trunk curling and uncurling in slow, rhythmic movements. He could hear her breathing now, the low, steady pull and release of air. For a moment, no one moved. Then the calf's trunk twitched again, his body loosening just slightly under Samuel's hand. The moment was small, but in this heat, any gain meant the difference between holding on and slipping away. The water had begun to work, and the mother, for now, was letting them continue. The ground vibrated faintly under Samuel's knees before he even looked up. The mother had moved. Her steps were slow but direct, the kind that closed distance without haste yet carried the weight of intent. Dust lifted at each placement of her feet, drifting across the narrow space between them. Samuel didn't shift his position. The calf's head remained in his lap, the airway open, the small breaths steady but fragile. Leah held her position off to the side, eyes locked on the mother's approach, ready to speak if Samuel needed her, but knowing that stillness was their best signal now. The air felt heavier with each step the mother took, the tension wrapping around the clearing. If she decided the line had been crossed, there would be no chance to react in time. She stopped just short of touching him, her broad shadow falling over his shoulders. The light around the calf dimmed under her bulk. Her trunk extended slowly, the tip hovering first over Samuel's forearm, then lowering to brush lightly along her calf's flank. The contact drew a faint reflexive twitch from the small body. Her breath was steady and warm against Samuel's sleeve, carrying the dry scent of grass and dust. He kept his breathing matched to hers, slow and even, his hands unmoving except to adjust the calf's head fractionally so the trunk tip no longer pressed against the ground. The mother's eyes shifted from her calf to him and back, each pause deliberate as though weighing what she saw. Leah's hand was still on the water basin, but she didn't move to offer it. Any interruption could break the moment's fragile calm. The mother's trunk moved again, tracing the same path over the calf's side, then curling beneath the small body as though testing its weight. She did not lift. She only supported it for a brief second before letting the calf rest back fully in Samuel's hold. The message was clear enough. She was not there to take him away, not yet, but she was no passive observer. If she judged his condition worsening, she would intervene on her own terms. The calf's breathing held its thin rhythm, but the effort in each rise of the ribs was visible. Samuel knew the cooling and hydration had bought them time, but the heat and the calf's weakened state meant that window could close again quickly. The mother's proximity was both a sign of trust and a risk in itself. At this range, a sudden shift in her judgment could turn defensive without warning. Every move from here had to serve the same goal, keeping the calf stable without breaking the trust her approach implied. Her ears moved in slow, outward arcs before folding back, a gesture neither fully relaxed nor alarmed. She stood over them without shifting her feet for a long minute, her presence as much a shield from the sun as a barrier against anything else approaching. Samuel could feel the faint tremor of muscle in the calf's neck as it pressed against his arm, a reminder that energy was still draining with every shallow breath. If the mother chose to take the calf now, they would lose any ability to support him further, but if they tried to hold him back, the outcome would be worse. The mother lowered her head again, trunk passing over Samuel's knee before returning to the calf's side. This time she let it linger there, the curve of it holding still, her breathing even. It was as close to acceptance as the moment allowed. Samuel stayed quiet, his hand resting flat along the calf's shoulder, keeping the head lifted. The heat of the mother's shadow covered them both, the dust settling back to the ground as she stood, immovable and watchful. The silence broken only by the shared sound of breathing, one strong, one fragile but still holding. The mother's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight rocking forward onto her front feet. Samuel stayed still, the calf's head still resting against his lap, every muscle in his body trained to keep calm in the narrowing space between them. Without warning or hesitation, she lowered her trunk and let it pass under her calf's small, fragile body. The movement was deliberate, the tip curling around the ribs with just enough pressure to find purchase without causing harm. The calf gave a faint, startled exhale, his legs trembling but making no effort to rise on their own. For a long moment she held him like that, testing the balance, gauging the weight. Samuel's hand eased away from the shoulder, leaving her to take the lead. With a controlled lift, she raised the calf just far enough for his front legs to slide beneath him. His knees wobbled, the joints folding slightly before locking again. The effort seemed to drain him instantly. His sides heaved, the skin pulling tight over his ribs. But the mother didn't release him. She adjusted her hold, nudging his hindquarters until his back legs found the ground. The calf swayed, leaning into her body for support, his trunk hanging limp and his head low. Samuel's instinct was to step in, but he knew that any sudden move now could be read as a challenge for control. Leah exhaled quietly from her position at the edge of the clearing. It was the first time since they had arrived that the calf had been upright, however unsteady. His breathing was rapid now, the extra effort of standing pulling energy from reserves that were already dangerously low. If he collapsed again too soon, the strain could be more than his weakened muscles and heart could bear. The mother's flank pressed gently against his side, forming a living barrier that held him upright without forcing him to move. She was doing what they had hoped to do, stabilizing him, but on her own terms. The calf's head lifted slightly, his ears twitching at a low sound from her throat. It was not a call meant to carry far, but a private note between them, a reassurance that her presence was constant. Samuel watched the way her trunk lingered along his back, occasionally shifting to keep his posture balanced. Every adjustment seemed to coax him into bearing a little more of his own weight, but never so much that he tipped into collapse. If she stepped away too soon, his legs would likely give out. If she overcorrected, the strain could tip the balance the other way. A faint rustle passed through the thornbush behind them, but the mother didn't turn her head. Her focus was fixed entirely on the calf, her ears steady and her eyes half lowered in concentration. His breathing began to slow again, the rhythm settling into something less urgent. Samuel recognized it for what it was, not recovery, but a momentary reprieve. The body was conserving what little strength remained. They would still need to find shade and water soon, but the act of getting him to his feet had already altered his chances. It gave him circulation, a shift in pressure on the lungs, and the psychological cue to keep fighting for balance. The calf leaned more heavily against her now, his hind legs quivering but holding. Samuel stayed crouched where he was, knowing that for this moment, the best help they could give was simply to allow it to happen. The mother had taken the risk they had been debating for hours, and she had done it without force, without panic, and without pushing him beyond what his body could manage. In the quiet of the clearing, the only sound was the soft scrape of her foot in the dust as she adjusted her stance, keeping him close, keeping him steady. Her presence the single thing holding him upright against the weight of the heat and the long hours he had already endured. The rescue unfolded in the heat of late morning, when the air above the dry earth shimmered faintly and the thorn bushes cast short, sharp-edged shadows. The young calf had been on the ground for hours, his flanks sunken, his breathing shallow, and his head pressed awkwardly against the dirt so that his trunk bent beneath him. The mother had hovered at a distance, torn between the instinct to guard and the instinct to allow help, her stance shifting between forward-leaning watchfulness and still tense observation. Over time, the rangers had edged closer, moving in slow arcs and measured steps until Samuel, the lead ranger, could kneel beside the calf to assess his breathing and pulse. Every touch was deliberate, fingertips under the jawline, ear angled to feel the faint warmth of each breath, palm laid gently against the shoulder to gauge the expansion of the lungs. The signs were worrying. The pulse was weak, the breathing spaced out by long pauses, and the skin warm and dry with dehydration. Leah, his field assistant, kept her position just beyond the mother's line of tolerance, ready with a shallow basin of water. Small drops were offered through the calf's trunk, and damp cloths were pressed along the thin skin behind his ears and under his neck to cool him without shocking his system. This careful pacing was essential. Too much water too quickly could choke him, and too much cooling at once could trigger collapse. Each minute spent here was a gamble against the rising heat and the calf's fading reserves. When the calf's head remained pressed at an angle that could compromise his airway, Samuel acted. Sliding one arm beneath the neck and another under the chest, he lifted until the head rested in his lap, opening the airway into a straighter line. The calf's trunk spilt limply over his thigh, and Samuel adjusted his position so gravity wouldn't pull it back toward his face. The mother's reaction was immediate but controlled. A short, higher-pitched contact call carried across the space between them, not aggressive, but reminding everyone present whose calf this was. Still, she didn't move to stop him. Samuel held the calf there, feeling a faint improvement in the breathing rhythm, even if it was still shallow. He knew the position was buying them time, but also keeping them in a precarious place. If the mother decided this was interference, they would have no chance to retreat safely. It was then that she chose to close the gap. Her approach was slow but unbroken, dust puffing lightly beneath her feet. When she reached Samuel, her shadow fell over him and the calf, dimming the light and changing the temperature in an instant. Her trunk came forward, brushing over Samuel's forearm before sweeping gently along the calf's flank. The touch was careful and exploratory, followed by a pause where she simply stood over them, ears shifting in slow arcs. For a long moment she seemed to measure everything: the calf's breathing, Samuel's stillness, the entire balance of the scene. Then, without warning, she bent lower and slid her trunk under her calf's body. The tip curled upward and around, finding purchase beneath his ribs. With a controlled motion, she lifted just enough to slide his front legs beneath him. His knees wobbled, threatened to fold, but she did not release. A second shift of her trunk brought the hind legs into place, and soon he was standing, unsteady, swaying, leaning heavily against her flank but upright for the first time in hours. Samuel watched without intervening, understanding that she was now doing the work they had been preparing to attempt themselves. She adjusted her position so that her body shielded him from the sun and formed a living barrier against the thornbush. Each nudge from her trunk or shoulder kept him balanced, preventing his legs from folding beneath him. She moved with remarkable precision, encouraging small weight shifts while ensuring he didn't take on more than he could bear. The calf's breathing grew faster at first, as his body adjusted to standing, but then it began to settle again into a rhythm that suggested some stability. This was the moment that altered the course of the rescue, the point where maternal instinct aligned perfectly with the careful pacing of the human team's efforts. The calf, now upright, had better circulation, less lung compression, and a posture that would make further breathing easier. After a pause, the mother gave a soft, low rumble that carried reassurance and perhaps a signal to move. She stepped forward a fraction, and the calf followed, his first steps shaky but sure enough to hold. Samuel stayed where he was, lowering his hands slowly, aware that his role in this rescue was coming to an end. The pair moved as one toward a break in the thornbush. Every step was deliberate, the mother matching her stride to his, ready to stop if his legs faltered. Once they reached the narrow path to the open plain, she paused, angling her body so that the sun fell across his side again. He stood for a few seconds, breathing harder, then took another step forward, this time with a fraction more certainty. The plain beyond offered pale grass that shifted lightly under a faint breeze, and the air felt cooler where it moved freely. The mother guided him through, her flank brushing his at intervals, her trunk occasionally sliding across his back in a steadying gesture. Behind them, the rangers remained still, watching the distance widen. Leah still held the basin, but they both knew that the opportunity to offer more water would have to wait until, if the mother allowed contact again. For now, the choice was hers. Interfering at this stage could undo the fragile trust that had allowed the rescue to happen at all. As they moved farther across the plain, the calf's steps became more even, though still cautious. His head remained low, conserving energy, but there was no collapse. The mother's pace stayed constant, never pushing him to go faster. The two figures, side by side, began to shrink against the expanse of grass and scattered acacia. Dust rose faintly behind them, then drifted away on the breeze. In the last stretch before they disappeared from view, she curved her body so they were almost shoulder to shoulder, her trunk resting briefly across his back before returning to her side. A final glint of movement marked their passing into the distance, and then the plain swallowed them. The clearing behind was silent again, holding only the memory of a calf that had been lifted from the dust and guided, step by step, back into the wild.